It remembers the aces, the squadron leaders, the decorated heroes who stood in front of cameras after missions and spoke of courage and sacrifice. It remembers the generals who moved pins across maps and the politicians who declared that victory was inevitable. But history rarely remembers the man in the back of the aircraft. High above Europe in 1943, inside the freezing belly of a heavy bomber, a young tail gunner sat alone in a transparent dome of plexiglass. Below him stretched a continent at war. Above him, nothing but sky. Behind him, the enemy. He had no control over where the aircraft flew. He did not choose the target. He did not decide when to turn back. His job was simpler and far more terrifying. He watched the sky behind them. The bomber formation moved like a metallic river through the clouds. Hundreds of engines roared in synchronized vibration. The airframe trembled constantly, as if the aircraft itself was nervous. Inside the tail turret, it was colder than most people can imagine. At 25,000 feet, temperatures dropped far below freezing. Oxygen masks pressed against faces. Frost formed along metal edges. The gunner's breath crystallized in the air before disappearing. He wore layers of gear: heated suit, gloves, parachute harness, flak vest. Even so, the cold found its way in. The turret was narrow, barely enough space to move. He sat facing backward, knees bent, feet braced, twin machine guns extending on either side of him like metallic wings. There was no armor protecting his back, only glass. From his position, he saw something no one else in the aircraft could see clearly: approaching fighters. And in the European theater of World War II, enemy fighters did not attack politely. They hunted. German interceptor pilots knew something critical about heavy bombers. The nose bristled with guns. The top had turrets. The sides were protected. But the most vulnerable angle, the deadliest approach, was directly from behind, closing fast, slightly below, climbing upward, right into the bomber's blind spot. Unless a tail gunner stopped them. The first sign of danger was usually small: a glint, a flash of sunlight reflecting off a wing, a speck growing larger against clouds. At 400 miles per hour, distance disappeared quickly. The gunner had seconds, sometimes less. He would lean forward, squint through the sight, heart pounding in his ears louder than the engines. "Fighter, 6 o'clock low." His voice would crackle through the intercom, instantly shifting the mood of the entire crew. Inside the cockpit, the pilot would tighten his grip. Inside the waist section, gunners would swing their weapons toward the threat. But the tail gunner, he had the first shot, and often the last. Combat in the sky was not like combat on the ground. There were no trenches, no cover to hide behind, no trees or buildings, just open air and gravity waiting below. Enemy fighters would surge upward in violent bursts, cannons flashing, tracers slicing through the sky like red-hot wires. The tail gunner would squeeze his triggers. Twin .50 caliber machine guns would roar to life, the recoil shaking his entire body. Spent shell casings rattled around him. Smoke and cordite filled the small compartment. For a moment, it was chaos, sound, vibration, flashing light. He aimed not at where the enemy was, but where would be, because at those speeds, hesitation meant death. Sometimes he saw the fighter break away, rolling sharply to avoid the incoming fire. Sometimes he saw smoke, and sometimes he saw it coming straight at him. There were moments when enemy pilots committed fully to the attack, knowing that if they could disable the bomber's tail defense, the entire aircraft would be exposed. Closing distance, 200 yards. In those final seconds, the tail gunner could see the other pilot's canopy, the shape of his helmet, the outline of his machine guns firing. It became personal. Not two nations, not two flags, just two young men separated by glass and speed. One of them would survive the next 10 seconds. The other might not. The life expectancy of tail gunners in certain bombing campaigns was brutally short. They were among the most vulnerable crew members. If the bomber took fire from behind, the tail was often the first section hit. If the aircraft exploded, the blast traveled backward. If the tail was severed, the gunner had almost no chance to escape. Parachuting from that position was possible, but rarely practical under heavy fire. And yet, Thousands of young men volunteered for that role, not because it was safe, but because someone had to do it. He was 19 years old, maybe 20. Back home, he had been a student, a mechanic, a farmhand, a factory worker. Now he was the last line of defense for 10 other men inside that aircraft. 10 lives depending on his awareness, on his aim, on his nerve. If he missed a fighter approaching from behind, it could tear through the fuselage. Engines could ignite. Wings could snap. Entire crews could vanish in seconds. The bomber group counted on formation, flying for protection. Overlapping fields of fire created a defensive wall of bullets. But every formation had gaps, and enemy pilots were trained to find them. There were missions where the sky turned black with flak. Anti-aircraft explosions burst around the bombers like violent blossoms of smoke. The aircraft shuddered. Metal fragments punched through skin and structure. Sometimes the tail gunner felt the entire frame lurch as shrapnel struck near him. Sometimes pieces of glass shattered. Sometimes the aircraft ahead would suddenly tilt, trailing fire. From his rear-facing position, he often had the clearest view of what was happening behind the formation. He saw bombers fall out of line. He saw parachutes bloom. He saw fire. He saw aircraft spiral downward into cloud cover, never to be seen again. And he kept scanning the sky, because stopping to process fear was not an option. There is something uniquely isolating about being the last man in the aircraft. The cockpit was full of conversation. The waist gunners could see each other. But in the tail turret, the gunner sat alone, surrounded by glass, surrounded by sky. His world was 180 degrees of airspace behind them. He could not see the target ahead. He did not watch the bombs fall. His war was defensive, reactive, immediate, and brutally intimate. When the mission ended and the bombers turned for home, the tension did not immediately disappear. Enemy fighters often attacked during withdrawal. Low fuel, damaged engines, straggling aircraft. The tail gunner remained vigilant until the coastline appeared. Only then did some crews allow themselves to breathe. Landing was not glamorous either. Heavy bombers returned riddled with holes. Hydraulics failed. Tires burst. Brakes malfunctioned. If the aircraft crash-landed, the tail section could crumple first. Even on the runway, his position carried risk. After missions, ground crews would walk around the aircraft counting holes. Sometimes they counted dozens near the tail. Bullet impacts inches from where he had been sitting. The realization came later, during quiet moments, when adrenaline faded, when he lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling. He would replay the fighter that came too close, the tracers that passed near his head, the way the aircraft shook when flak hit nearby. And he would understand something heavy. He had survived by seconds, sometimes by inches, but there were victories too. Moments where his accurate fire forced an attacker to break off. Moments when he watched the pursuing fighter roll away trailing smoke. Moments when the formation held together because the rear defense was strong. Those moments rarely made headlines. No press conference. No dramatic photographs. Just a quiet acknowledgement among the crew. Good shooting back there. And sometimes that was enough. War from the tail was not about glory. It was about awareness, about endurance, about refusing to blink when fear demanded it, because blinking could cost everything. And somewhere over Europe, inside a frozen glass turret, a young man kept his eyes open. He did not know if historians would remember him. He did not know if statues would ever stand in his name. He only knew that behind him, in that endless sky, danger was always approaching. And as long as he was alive, no one would reach his crew without a fight. And then came the mission that changed everything. It was late autumn 1943. The target was deep inside enemy territory, heavily defended, strategically critical, and almost guaranteed to trigger response. The briefing room that morning had been unusually quiet. No jokes, no nervous laughter, just maps, red circles, altitude numbers, and the understanding that not every aircraft would return. The bomber lifted off before dawn, engines echoing across the cold runway. One by one, the formation assembled in the gray morning sky. From his position in the tail, he watched other bombers slide into place ahead of them, metallic silhouettes against the rising light. Everything looked calm. Too calm. The first hour passed without incident. Only the constant drone of engines and the faint crackle of radio chatter filled his headset. Below them, clouds stretched like an endless white ocean. Then the flak began. Black bursts erupted in the distance at first, harmless looking from afar. But as they moved deeper toward the target, the explosions tightened around the formation. The aircraft jolted violently. Metal screamed. Fragments struck the fuselage like thrown gravel. He tightened his grip on the guns. Flak heavy at 6 o'clock high, someone reported. The sky was no longer empty. It was alive. And then he saw it. Not flak, not smoke. Movement. Tiny shapes slicing upward through the cloud layer. Fast. Deliberate. Fighters coming in. 6 o'clock low. His voice cut through the intercom. In seconds, the calm formation turned into a battlefield. Enemy interceptors climbed aggressively from below, using the sun behind them. They had chosen their angle well. The first fighter opened fire before he was fully lined up. Tracers streaked past the tail, bright red lines against blue sky. He fired back immediately. The turret shook violently as both machine guns erupted. The sound inside the enclosure was deafening, a mechanical thunder that vibrated through bone. The fighter closed distance. Too fast. He adjusted his aim ahead of the nose of the attacking aircraft, leading the target. The two streams of bullets met in the middle of the sky. For a split second, the fighter disappeared behind smoke. Then it rolled sharply, breaking off the attack. No time to celebrate. Another one was already diving in. This one approached from slightly above, angling down toward the tail. A dangerous maneuver. He tracked it carefully. Waited. Closer. Closer. He could see the muzzle flashes clearly now. The enemy pilot was committed. The distance collapsed to less than 150 yards. His finger tightened. He fired in a controlled burst. The fighter shuddered midair. A flash near the engine. Then flame. The aircraft veered violently, passing beneath the bomber before spiraling downward into the clouds. Inside the turret, there was no cheer, only breathing. Fast. Controlled. Because 3 more fighters were forming up behind. The bomber formation began to break slightly under pressure. One aircraft to their right trailed smoke from an engine. Another dropped lower, struggling to maintain altitude. Enemy pilots focused on the stragglers. That was their tactic. Isolate, overwhelm, destroy. From his rear-facing position, he saw something the others didn't. 2 fighters lining up on the damaged bomber behind them. If they reached it unchallenged, it would not survive. He opened fire early, long range, forcing them to maneuver. The distraction worked. One fighter peeled away toward him instead. Now it was personal again. The fighter came in steady, guns blazing. Rounds struck near the turret. A crack splintered across one panel of glass. Cold air rushed in violently. Warning lights flickered in the aircraft. He ignored it, focused. The distance closed to 100 yards. Time slowed. He could see the pilot's face now, blurred but unmistakably human. Young, determined. He fired. Not wildly, precisely. The fighter's wings snapped upward as bullets tore through it. The aircraft rolled uncontrollably and vanished beneath them. Silence followed. Not complete silence. Engines still roared. Flak still burst in the distance, but the immediate threat behind them was gone. For now. Then came the explosion. Not from behind. From within the formation. A bomber slightly above and ahead took a direct flak hit near its center section. It detonated midair. Fragments scattered outward in all directions. He watched pieces of wing and fuselage tumble past their aircraft. A parachute appeared briefly. Then another. Then nothing. The formation tightened instinctively. No one spoke for several seconds, because there were no words that helped. They reached the target area under heavy resistance. Bomb bay doors open ahead. From the tail, he saw bombers releasing their payloads, dark shapes dropping toward the earth far below. Enemy fighters returned once more during the withdrawal. Lower fuel, damaged aircraft, fatigue setting in. This was when mistakes happened. A fighter approached unseen from high 6. At the last possible second, he caught the movement. He swung the turret upward sharply and fired. The rounds forced the attacker to pull up violently. overshooting the bomber. It passed so close he felt the turbulence rock the tail. If he had looked away for even 2 seconds, the outcome would have been different. By the time they crossed back over friendly territory, ammunition was low. The aircraft carried visible damage. Hydraulic fluid leaked. The cracked glass in the turret whistled constantly, but they were alive. As the coastline appeared beneath them, a wave of exhaustion replaced adrenaline. His hands were shaking now, not during combat. After, when the danger had passed, that was when fear finally arrived. Back on the ground, mechanics counted over 60 bullet holes in the tail section alone. One had pierced just inches from where his head had been. Another had grazed part of the turret frame. He stared at those holes silently. It did not feel heroic. It felt fragile, like survival had balanced on something razor-thin. That mission would be remembered by historians for the industrial damage inflicted below. It would be remembered by commanders for its strategic value. But for him, it would always be remembered for 10 seconds of eye contact in the sky, for cracked glass, for a bomber that disappeared in midair, for the understanding that war in the sky was not distant or abstract. It was immediate, close enough to see the other pilot's face, close enough to understand that both of them were just young men following orders written by people far away. And yet, the next morning, he would climb back into that turret again, because the formation needed a tail gunner, and someone had to watch the sky behind them. After enough missions, something changes inside a man, not on the outside, not in photographs, but somewhere deeper, where fear settles quietly and never fully leaves. By the winter of 1943, the sky no longer looked empty to him. It looked hostile. Every cloud felt suspicious. Every reflection felt like a threat. Every vibration of the aircraft made his muscles tense automatically. He no longer waited to see fighters. He expected them. The missions blended together. Briefing rooms, target maps, engine noise, flak bursts, fighter attacks, debriefings, then sleep, then repeat. But sleep wasn't really sleep. Even on the ground, his mind stayed at 25,000 feet. He would wake suddenly, heart racing, convinced he had missed something behind him. Sometimes he dreamed of tracers rising from darkness. Sometimes he saw bombers falling through clouds with no sound at all. And sometimes he dreamed of nothing, just endless sky. The crew had grown closer. Combat does that. 10 men sharing the same aircraft, the same risk, the same narrow escape routes. In the mess hall, they joked loudly, too loudly. Humor became armor. They gave each other nicknames. They exaggerated stories. They pretended the danger was manageable. But every time one bunk in the barracks stayed empty after a mission, the jokes became thinner. Replacement crews arrived constantly. Young faces, nervous smiles. The veterans could spot them instantly because they used to look the same. Statistically, completing a full tour of missions was unlikely in certain phases of the air war over Europe. Everyone knew it. They didn't always say it out loud, but the numbers were understood. Each mission carried risk. Each successful return felt like borrowed time. And for the tail gunner, the risk felt closer, more direct. He had seen too many aircraft break apart from behind, too many tails ripped away by cannon fire, too many parachutes that never opened. He carried those images silently, because there was nowhere to put them. Night missions were different, more disorienting, more unpredictable. The sky turned black and depth disappeared. Fighters were harder to see, but so was he. Searchlights sometimes stabbed upward from the ground, locking onto bombers and holding them in bright white beams. Those moments were terrifying, illuminated, exposed. He would feel the aircraft maneuver sharply to break the light's grip. Anti-aircraft fire would follow the beam. Explosions would bloom around them in brilliant flashes. Inside the turret, it felt like floating inside a thunderstorm made of steel. One night, during a return mission under partial cloud cover, he saw something he would never forget. A bomber behind them had taken heavy damage. Its right wing burned steadily. The aircraft struggled to maintain altitude. No fighters in sight, just gravity. From his position, he watched as the burning bomber slowly dropped lower. No explosion, no dramatic break apart, just a slow, Inevitable descent into darkness. No parachutes visible. The crew likely still inside. He kept watching until clouds swallowed it completely. No one spoke about it after landing, because everyone had seen it, and everyone understood. The physical strain added up too. Long hours in freezing temperatures. Heavy gear. Constant tension in the neck and shoulders from scanning the sky. His fingers sometimes went numb despite heated gloves. Eyes strained from searching distant horizons. There were days when exhaustion felt heavier than fear. But exhaustion could not replace vigilance, because fighters did not care if he was tired. Letters from home arrived occasionally. Simple things. Weather updates. Family news. Neighbors asking when he would return. He read them carefully. Sometimes twice. He never described the full reality in his replies. He wrote about clouds, about teamwork, about doing his duty. He did not write about cracked glass, or seeing another bomber disappear, or watching enemy pilots up close in the final seconds before impact. Some things stayed in the sky. As missions accumulated, something else changed. He became faster, more instinctive, where once he hesitated. Now he reacted immediately. His eyes tracked movement without conscious effort. He learned to recognize attack patterns before they fully formed. He learned to read subtle changes in formation spacing. Experience made him more dangerous, but it also made him more aware of how thin survival truly was. Confidence and vulnerability lived side by side inside him. One afternoon mission, clear skies stretching endlessly behind them, felt almost peaceful. Too peaceful. He scanned left, right, high, low, nothing. Minutes passed. Then, barely visible, far beyond comfortable distance, contrails. Thin white lines cutting across blue. High-altitude fighters positioning for a diving attack. He alerted the crew early. The formation tightened. Gunners prepared. When the fighters finally dove, they were met with coordinated defensive fire. The attack broke apart before reaching optimal range. Later, the pilot told him quietly, "You saved us a rough one back there." It wasn't dramatic. No handshake ceremony. Just a statement. And in that statement was acknowledgement. He mattered, not as a symbol, but as a function of survival. Still, the cost accumulated internally. Every near miss added weight. Every lost aircraft added silence to barracks. He began to understand that even if he survived the war physically, parts of him would remain at altitude, suspended somewhere above Europe, frozen in that glass turret. Toward the end of that winter, his crew was scheduled for what would likely be one of their final missions before completing their required number. There was cautious optimism, almost disbelief. They had outlasted statistics, outflown probabilities. But war does not reward optimism. It simply waits. And the sky behind them was never empty for long. The final mission did not feel heroic. It did not begin with dramatic music or confident speeches. It began like all the others. Cold morning air, muted footsteps across the runway, engines warming in the half-light before dawn. But inside the briefing room, something felt different. This would likely complete their required number of missions. One more, just one more safe return. That thought was more dangerous than fear, because hope can make a man careless, and the sky does not forgive carelessness. Takeoff was smooth. The bomber climbed steadily, joining formation as sunlight broke across the horizon. Other aircraft formed up around them, familiar silhouettes that had survived just as long. From the tail, he watched them settle into position. He had memorized the shape of this view, the slight vibration in the guns, the way condensation formed along the glass, the faint distortion at the edge of his vision. He knew this turret better than his own bedroom back home. And today, he told himself, would be the last time. The first half of the mission was quiet, unusually quiet. No early flak, no immediate fighters. The crew even relaxed slightly over the intercom. Small jokes returned. Someone mentioned dinner plans if they made it back early. He didn't laugh, because he had learned something important. The sky is quiet right before it turns violent. The target came into view. Bomb bay doors open ahead in the formation. Then the flak began. Heavy, accurate. Explosions erupted dangerously close to the aircraft. The bomber jolted as a burst detonated beneath the tail. Warning lights flickered briefly. He checked his controls, still operational, but the formation had tightened under pressure, and tight formations made perfect targets. Then he saw them. High, fast, more than before. A full wave of interceptors diving out of the sun. Fighters. Multiple. 6 o'clock high. His voice cut sharp and immediate. This wasn't a probing attack. This was coordinated. The first fighter dove almost vertically, cannons firing before leveling out. He swung the turret upward and fired in controlled bursts. Tracers crossed paths midair. The fighter pulled up hard at the last second, barely missing collision. But two more were already climbing from below. They split their approach. One low, one slightly offset to the right. He had seconds to choose. He targeted the lower one first, the more dangerous angle. He fired. The fighter wobbled but continued firing back. Rounds struck the tail section violently. The turret shuddered. A metallic crack echoed through the frame. He smelled burning insulation, but he did not stop firing. At less than 120 yards, his burst connected cleanly with the engine cowling. The fighter erupted into smoke and peeled away. But the second attacker had closed distance during the exchange. Too close. The incoming fighter filled his entire field of vision. Guns flashing, closing fast. The glass in front of him spider-cracked from impact. Cold air blasted through the compartment. For a split second, he felt exposed, completely exposed, suspended between earth and sky with nothing but damaged glass protecting him. The fighter was committed. No evasive maneuver. No hesitation. Just straight in. Time compressed. He adjusted aim slightly upward, instinct more than thought. And he fired. A long, sustained burst. The recoil rattled his bones. The fighter's canopy flashed. Then the left wing tore violently. The aircraft veered off course at the last possible moment. Passing so close he felt the shock wave rock the tail. It spiraled downward out of sight. Silence didn't follow. More fighters circled at a distance. But the primary attack wave had broken. The formation, though damaged, held. Smoke trailed from one of their engines. Hydraulic pressure was unstable. But they were still airborne. He checked ammunition. Low, very low, and they were still deep in enemy territory. The return flight felt longer than any before. Every shadow looked like another attacker. Every distant speck forced his pulse higher. But no second wave came. The sky slowly emptied behind them. Clouds rolled beneath. The coastline eventually appeared faint in the distance. Friendly territory. He did not celebrate. Not yet, because landing was never guaranteed. As they descended, structural damage became more obvious. The aircraft vibrated irregularly. The pilot announced limited tail control response. He felt it too. The aircraft was slightly sluggish in yaw. If the tail had been hit more severely, they might not have made it this far. The runway finally came into view. Long, solid, real. The wheels touched hard. The aircraft bounced once, then settled, rolling to a stop amid ground crews rushing forward. Engines powered down one by one, and for the first time in hours, there was true silence. He remained seated for a moment inside the cracked turret, hands still resting on the guns, breathing slowly. The realization arrived gradually. He had survived, not just the mission, but the tour. He unstrapped carefully and climbed out. On the ground, mechanics immediately inspected the tail section. Damage was extensive. Several rounds had penetrated within inches of critical control cables. One fragment had lodged inside the turret frame, centimeters from where his head had been. Again, inches, seconds, margins so thin they barely felt real. The crew gathered near the aircraft. No cheering, no dramatic speeches, just quiet acknowledgement. They had done their job. They had watched each other's backs. And the tail gunner, the man who faced backward into danger every mission, had once again kept the sky behind them contested. Not conquered, contested, because that was enough. Years later, historians would study bombing campaigns. They would analyze tonnage dropped, strategic outcomes, production disruptions. They would name generals and cite statistics. But somewhere within those numbers were moments that never appeared in reports. Moments of eye contact between opposing pilots. Moments where survival depended on a trigger pulled half a second earlier. Moments inside a frozen glass turret at 25,000 feet. The tail gunners were rarely photographed, rarely celebrated, rarely remembered individually. But without them, many bombers would never have returned. Many crews would never have stepped back onto runways. Many stories would have ended midair. History does not always change with speeches. Sometimes it changes in silence, in a narrow compartment at the back of an aircraft, in the hands of someone barely old enough to shave, in the decision not to look away, because behind every formation, someone was watching the sky, and sometimes that was the difference between fire and flight, between loss and landing, between memory and oblivion. If this story gave you a new perspective on the unseen roles of World War II, consider subscribing, because some battles were fought in full view of history, and some were fought behind glass, where the last line of defense never expected to be remembered, but deserves to be.